Asheville smelled like rain that first week of October, that particular mountain town rain that came down soft and gray over Biltmore Avenue, pooling in the cracks of old brick sidewalks and making the whole city glisten like it had been dipped in something sweet. Oliver Bennett, 26, was not thinking about rain. He was thinking about the 6 dozen cinnamon rolls proofing in the back of Sweet Ridge Bakery, the shop his grandmother had left him 18 months earlier, and about the fact that his dog, a scrappy brown mutt named Biscuit, had just bolted out the propped-open back door the second Oliver turned to answer the phone. Biscuit! No, Biscuit! He didn't even grab an apron. He ran out into the wet alley in his flour-dusted t-shirt, socks soaked through inside his Crocs, chasing a dog who had absolutely no intention of stopping. Rain needled his face. Somewhere behind him, the bell over the bakery door jangled uselessly, unanswered, and Oliver made a private, breathless vow to install a better latch on that back door the moment his life stopped being an emergency. 2 blocks away, on the corner lot where an old textile warehouse was being gutted and rebuilt into something new, William Hayes stood on a half-finished scaffold, phone pressed to his ear, trying to convince a client in Charlotte that yes, the exposed brick could absolutely stay. No, it would not compromise the structural integrity, and yes, he understood the budget concerns. A blur of brown fur shot between his legs. Will didn't even have time to yelp before the leash, dragging loose behind the dog, caught around his ankle, and the next thing he knew, one of Asheville's most promising young architects was flat on his back in a puddle of drywall dust and rainwater, phone skittering somewhere into the mud, his very expensive charcoal gray coat now the exact texture of a wet flour sack. "Oh my God, I am so sorry." Oliver arrived seconds later, breathless, hair plastered to his forehead, staring down at the stranger he'd just tackled by proxy. And here was the thing about Oliver Bennett. He had spent his whole life being the guy who tripped over his own feet, who called customers sir when they were clearly not sirs, who had once accidentally set off the bakery's fire alarm trying to caramelize sugar with a blowtorch he did not actually know how to use. He was used to being the punchline of his own stories. He was not, however, used to the punchline looking like this. The man on the ground had dark hair, now speckled white with drywall dust, and eyes the deep brown of good coffee, currently narrowed at Oliver, with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and reluctant amusement. He was built like someone who worked with his hands as much as his mind, broad through the shoulders, forearms visible where his sleeves had rolled up in the fall, a faint white scar cutting through one dark eyebrow. Even soaked and dusted in construction debris, he had the kind of face that made Oliver temporarily forget the English language. "Your dog," the man said, voice low and a little rough, just took out a grown man. He's usually very well behaved," Oliver said, which was a lie so enormous that Biscuit, now happily licking mud off the stranger's shoe, seemed personally offended on Oliver's behalf. "Is that so?" He gets excited, about puddles, about squirrels, and apparently about expensive coats. The man looked down at himself, at the ruin of what had clearly been a very nice coat, and let out a short laugh, more air than sound but real. This was dry clean only. "I will pay for the dry cleaning," Oliver said quickly, extending a hand to help him up, immediately regretting it because his own hand was still coated in flour and now left 5 white fingerprints across the man's palm. "Oh, sorry, I own the bakery back there. I was mid-cinnamon roll emergency. A cinnamon roll emergency. They don't wait for anyone." The man took his hand anyway and let Oliver haul him upright, which took considerably more effort than Oliver expected, because the guy was heavy, all muscle, unmoving as a fence post, and for one absurd second their faces were close enough that Oliver could smell rain and cedar on him, and underneath that, something warm and clean, like a memory Oliver hadn't made yet but somehow already missed. "William Hayes," the man said, brushing wet dust off his sleeves with visible resignation. "I'm the architect on this build, which, until about 60 seconds ago, I thought was going reasonably well." "Oliver Bennett," Oliver said. "Sweet Ridge Bakery, which, until about 60 seconds ago, I thought had a well-trained dog." Will, because that was clearly what people called him, Oliver decided instantly, looked down at Biscuit, who was now sitting obediently at his feet like butter wouldn't melt, tail thumping against the wet pavement. He looks pretty pleased with himself. He always does. It's infuriating. For a moment neither of them said anything, and the rain kept falling, soft and gray, and somewhere behind Oliver's ribs something shifted, quiet and unfamiliar, like a door easing open in a house he'd thought had no more rooms left to find. "I really am sorry about your coat," Oliver said again, quieter this time. Will studied him a moment, flour on his cheek, hair dripping, apologetic in a way that seemed to cost him something, and whatever he saw made the corner of his mouth tip up, easy and unforced. "Tell you what," Will said. "You give me one of those cinnamon rolls you were so worried about, and we'll call it even." Oliver blinked. "That seems like a bad trade for you. You lost a coat." "I gained a story," Will said, already turning to retrieve his ruined phone from the mud, "about the day I got taken down by a bakery dog in front of my own job site. That's worth at least a pastry." Oliver led him back to Sweet Ridge, with Biscuit trotting between them, entirely too pleased with the outcome of his morning, and by the time they reached the bakery's fogged front window, the rain had softened to a fine mist that clung to Will's dark hair like something deliberate. Inside, the shop was warm and gold, cinnamon and yeast thick in the air, and Oliver watched Will's shoulders ease the moment the door shut out the weather behind them, watched him take in the mismatched chairs, the chalkboard menu, the pressed tin ceiling Miss Rosie had installed decades ago, with the unguarded curiosity of someone cataloging a place he already suspected he'd be coming back to. "Sit anywhere," Oliver said, already pulling a tray from the case. "On the house. Least I can do for a coat casualty." Will chose the small table by the window, the one with a slight wobble Oliver had never quite fixed, and when Oliver set the cinnamon roll down in front of him, still warm glaze pooling soft at the edges, Will took one bite and went, for a moment, entirely and genuinely quiet. "Okay," he admitted, around a second bite. "This might actually be worth the coat. High praise. I don't give it easily." Will glanced up, rain-damp and dust-streaked, and despite it all, wholly unbothered, something warm flickering behind his eyes, that Oliver felt all the way down to his soaking wet socks. "I'll be back tomorrow to confirm it wasn't a fluke." He came back the next morning. Oliver noticed him through the fogged front window before the bell over the door even rang, recognized the set of his shoulders, the easy, loose-limbed way he walked, like he had nowhere urgent to be, even when, as Oliver would later learn, he almost always did. "You're alive," Oliver said, sliding a rag along the pastry case, aiming for casual and landing somewhere closer to visibly delighted. "Barely." "My dry cleaner said the coat's beyond saving." Will's eyes swept the shop, exposed beams, mismatched vintage chairs, the chalkboard menu in Oliver's slightly crooked handwriting, and something in his expression softened, like he was cataloging it without meaning to. "This place is a lot better than my building. Your building's going to be beautiful. I've seen the renderings on the fence. You've been snooping on my construction fence. I walk Biscuit past it every morning. It's not snooping if it's public information." Will's mouth curved. "That's exactly what a snoop would say." He ordered a coffee and, after a beat of studying the case with real deliberation, a cinnamon roll. "For old time's sake," he said, and Oliver laughed before he could stop himself. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere low in his chest. It became a routine without either of them naming it one. Will showed up most mornings around 8, coffee first, cinnamon roll if any were left, and always, a few minutes of conversation that stretched longer than either of them planned. Some mornings it was easy talk about nothing. The weather, a stray cat that had taken up residence near the bus stop, whether pumpkin spice was a genuine flavor or a marketing conspiracy. Will argued the former. Oliver, predictably, the latter, if only to keep the debate alive. Other mornings the conversation went deeper before either of them quite noticed it happening. He learned that Oliver had inherited the bakery from his grandmother, Rosalind Bennett, a woman the whole neighborhood still called Miss Rosie, and that he'd left a marketing job in Raleigh to come run it because he couldn't stand the thought of her life's work closing its doors. Oliver learned that Will had grown up outside Charlotte, the son of a contractor, and had spent his 20s chasing bigger and bigger firms in bigger and bigger cities before realizing he wanted to build things he could actually watch get used. Not just skyscrapers nobody remembered the architect of. "You could have stayed in a city with real money," Oliver said one gray Tuesday, wiping down the counter while Will lingered longer than his coffee justified. "Why Asheville?" Will considered the question like it mattered, like all his answers did, weighed carefully before he let them out. "I wanted to build somewhere people actually looked up when they walked by, not just hurried past. And you did, chasing a dog. That doesn't count. It's the only data point I have," Will said. And there it was again, that quiet, easy smile that made something in Oliver's chest tilt sideways. One Thursday, a supplier's delivery mix-up left Sweet Ridge with $400 of the wrong flour and no walnuts at all for the morning's scheduled walnut banana loaves. Oliver was mid-meltdown behind the register, phone wedged against his shoulder, arguing with a distributor, when Will walked in, took one look at the chaos, set down his laptop bag without a word, and simply started unloading the delivery truck himself, hauling sacks of flour into the storage room like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You don't have to do that," Oliver said, hand over the receiver. "I have a 10 a.m. call I can take from anywhere," Will said, not even breaking stride. "Might as well take it here." By the time the distributor had agreed to a partial refund and a walnut delivery by noon, Will had reorganized half the storage room into something considerably more logical than Oliver's system had ever been, and Oliver stood in the doorway watching him work with an expression his best friend, and only full-time employee, Maddie Reyes, 24, would later describe accurately, infuriatingly, as heart-eyed emoji but a human man. "You get a weird voice," Maddie said that afternoon, elbow deep in dough, watching Will's retreating figure through the window. "When he's here, like you're narrating a nature documentary about yourself and trying not to startle the wildlife." "I do not have a weird voice." "Oh, hey, Will, didn't see you there," Maddie mimicked, pitching her voice up an octave. "You saw him cross the street 2 minutes ago. You watched him. Through the window, like a golden retriever waiting for the mail truck." "I hate you," Oliver said, without heat, cheeks going pink. "You hate that I'm right." As if summoned by the accusation itself, Will chose that exact moment to reappear at the counter, having briefly stepped out to take a call, and Oliver, flustered, caught red-handed mid-conversation about himself, promptly handed him a bag of day-old bagels instead of the fresh cinnamon roll Will had actually ordered. "These are not what I asked for," Will said, peering into the bag with polite confusion. "They're a seasonal special," Oliver said, with the particular confidence of a man improvising badly in real time. "Bagel season, it's very short. You're lucky to catch it." "It's October. Exactly. Prime bagel season." Will studied him for a long deadpan moment, clearly not buying a word of it, then simply said, "I'll take 6, and paid for them without further comment, a barely there smile tugging at the corner of his mouth the entire walk out the door. Maddie doubled over the pastry case in silent, wheezing laughter, did not let Oliver live down prime bagel season for the rest of the month. The big storm hit on a Thursday in late October, the kind that rolled down off the Blue Ridge Mountains fast and mean, dropping the temperature 10 degrees in an hour and knocking half the power out on Biltmore Avenue by 6 p.m. Oliver was closing up alone. Maddie had left early for a dentist appointment, juggling trash bags and a dying flashlight when a knock came at the fogged front door. Will, soaked through despite an umbrella that had clearly lost its fight with the wind somewhere along the way, stood on the other side, hair dripping, a folder of blueprints clutched protectively against his chest like it mattered more than staying dry. "Power's out at the job trailer," he said, when Oliver let him in. "And at my apartment, as it turns out. Figured you might have candles." "Bakeries always have candles. That's a stereotype. Do you have candles?" "Yes." They ended up sitting on overturned flour buckets in the back kitchen, 3 fat candles lit between them, rain hammering the metal roof in a rhythm that made the whole building feel like the inside of a drum. Oliver made hot chocolate from the shop's chocolate ganache stock because it was what he had on hand, and it turned out to be the best hot chocolate either of them had ever tasted. Rich and a little too sweet, exactly the kind of thing that tasted better in the dark during a storm than it ever would in daylight. "Can I ask you something?" Will said, turning his mug slowly between his hands, watching the candlelight catch in it, rather than looking at Oliver directly. The way people did, Oliver would learn, when a question mattered more than they wanted to admit. "Depends what it is. Why'd you really leave Raleigh? The marketing job. Miss Rosie's Bakery is a good reason, but it's not the whole reason, I can tell." Oliver was quiet for a moment, the candle flame trembling in the draft from the back door. He hadn't told this to many people, not the full shape of it. "I was engaged," he said finally. 2 years ago. To someone who decided, about a month before the wedding, that he didn't actually want to marry a guy who worked in a cubicle writing ad copy for regional grocery chains. Said he wanted someone with, his words, more direction. He gave a small, humorless laugh. "So I left. Not just him. The job, the city, all of it. Grandma Rosie needed help with the shop anyway. It felt like, I don't know, permission to want something smaller and truer instead of something impressive. Will was quiet for a long moment, and when Oliver finally looked up, he found those coffee-dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath catch somewhere behind his ribs. He was an idiot, Will said simply. You don't know him. I don't need to. Anyone who had you and decided he wanted more direction was looking at a compass and complaining it didn't point at money. Will's voice had gone low, rough at the edges in a way that hadn't been there a moment before. This place has more direction than half the buildings I've ever designed. It knows exactly what it is. So do you. The candlelight flickered between them, throwing gold across the plane of Will's cheekbone, catching in his eyes like something lit from within. Oliver's heart was doing something complicated and enormous in his chest, and for one long, suspended second, he thought, he was almost certain that Will was going to lean forward, close the small distance between the flower buckets, and... Thunder cracked outside, close enough to rattle the windows, and they both startled, laughing a little too loudly at their own nerves, the moment scattering like startled birds. But something had shifted. Oliver could feel it in the quiet after, in the way Will's knees stayed pressed lightly against his own, even once the thunder passed, in the way neither of them moved to put more space between the buckets. Something had opened, quiet and steady, like a door easing wider instead of shutting again. Thank you, Will said eventually, voice barely above the rain, for the candles, and the hot chocolate. And, he gestured vaguely, encompassing the kitchen, the storm, the whole strange golden hour of it. This. Anytime the power goes out, Oliver said, you know where to find me. I'm starting to think, Will said, standing, gathering his damp blueprints, pausing at the door with his hand on the frame, like he was reluctant to actually open it. That I'd find you even if it didn't. He left into the rain before Oliver could figure out what to say to that, and Oliver sat alone among the guttering candles for a long, long time, pressing his fingers lightly to his own sternum like he could feel, physically, the exact shape of the thing blooming there. The Neighborhood Association's Fall Festival happened the second weekend of November, 3 weeks after the storm. The whole stretch of Biltmore Avenue closing to traffic for an afternoon of food stalls, live bluegrass, and a bake sale table Oliver had somehow been talked into co-running. He hadn't expected Will's architecture firm to have a booth 2 tables down. A small, tasteful display of the Ridgeline Studios renderings, staffed by Will himself, and for the first hour, by a man Oliver hadn't met yet. Chris Delgado, 28, was Will's business partner and closest friend since architecture school, sharp-tongued, endlessly amused, with the specific energy of a man who had clearly appointed himself entertainment director for other people's love lives. He introduced himself to Oliver with a handshake and an expression that suggested he already knew a great deal more than he should. So you're the cinnamon roll guy, Chris said, glancing pointedly between Oliver and Will. Will talks about your bakery more than he talks about our actual client meetings. I do not, Will said, too quickly. You brought up the cinnamon rolls in a structural engineering meeting, William. That was one time. It was Tuesday. It is now Saturday. You've mentioned them at least 4 times since. Will's ears had gone faintly pink, which Oliver found so satisfying he nearly forgot to be embarrassed on his own behalf. He spent the better part of the afternoon, distracted by the sight of Will crouched at the edge of his own booth, patiently explaining structural load-bearing to a rapt cluster of 8-year-olds, who'd wandered over from the face-painting table, more patience, Oliver noted, than he'd ever seen Will extend to an actual paying client on the phone. Later, when the crowd thinned and Oliver was packing up unsold pastries, Chris sidled over, arms crossed, watching Will help a food truck vendor untangle a canopy tent 2 stalls away. You know you could just ask him out instead of memorizing the pastry menu, right? Chris said, loud enough that Will's head snapped up across the street, ears going pink all over again. Chris, I'm just saying, the man reorganized our supply closet alphabetically the week after he met you. That's not architect behavior. That's smitten behavior. Will crossed the distance between the booths so fast the tent canopy nearly came down behind him. We're leaving now. Goodbye, Oliver. Bye, Will, Oliver managed, biting back a laugh, heart hammering pleasantly against his ribs as Will steered Chris away by the shoulder, already muttering something that sounded like a threat involving Chris's parking spot. He came back 20 minutes later, alone, cheeks still faintly pink, and bought 4 cinnamon rolls he clearly didn't need under the flimsy pretext of supporting local business. Lingering at Oliver's table, long after the crowd had thinned, and the bluegrass band had packed up their instruments for the night, neither of them in any particular hurry to say goodbye. Then came the community garden. It started as a favor. The neighborhood association needed volunteers to help rebuild the raised beds behind the old Methodist church before the first hard frost, and Maddie, ever the instigator, had signed both Oliver and Will up without asking either of them, then conveniently developed a prior engagement the morning of. A prior engagement that, as far as Oliver could tell, consisted entirely of sleeping in and eating cereal in front of a true crime documentary, but he let it go, mostly because he suspected, correctly, exactly what she was up to. The morning was cold and bright, frost still silvering the grass along the church's edges, breath visible in small white clouds every time someone spoke. A dozen volunteers had turned out, mostly retirees and a handful of families with restless kids weaving between the raised beds, and Oliver arrived armed with a thermos of coffee and absolutely no relevant skills, a fact that became obvious within the first 10 minutes. Which was how Oliver found himself on his knees in damp soil on a crisp November Saturday, wrestling a stubborn cedar plank into place while Will knelt beside him, sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms streaked with dirt, looking entirely too good for a man doing manual labor in a church parking lot. "You're doing it wrong," Will said, not unkindly, reaching over to adjust the angle of the plank in Oliver's hands. His fingers brushed Oliver's, warm despite the cold morning air, and neither of them pulled away as quickly as the moment probably warranted. "I'm a baker, not a carpenter." Clearly, but Will was smiling, that quiet, easy smile, close enough now that Oliver could count the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, could see a smear of dirt along his jaw that he had the sudden overwhelming urge to wipe away with his thumb. "You've got!" Oliver gestured vaguely at his own jaw. "What? Dirt. Right, here." And before he could think better of it, Oliver reached out and brushed his thumb along Will's jaw, wiping the smear of soil away. Will went very, very still under his hand, dark eyes fixed on Oliver's face with an intensity that made the cold morning air suddenly feel too warm. "Oliver," Will said, voice low, rough, his own hand coming up to circle loosely around Oliver's wrist, not pulling it away, just holding it there, holding him there, thumb tracing slow over the thin skin of his pulse point. "Yeah? I need you to know I've been trying really hard not to do something inappropriate for a church parking lot." Oliver's breath caught. What kind of something? Will's gaze dropped, just briefly, to Oliver's mouth and back up. The kind that starts with kissing you and doesn't, historically, stay contained to just kissing. Heat flooded up Oliver's neck, his ears, and he was aware, distantly, absurdly, of an older woman from the church watering hydrangeas 20 feet away, of the whole ordinary Saturday morning continuing around them, birds and traffic and someone's radio playing softly from an open car window. "The garden bed can wait," Oliver said, voice barely steady. "Can it?" Will said, and it wasn't really a question. They didn't kiss, not there, not with a churchgoer and her watering can 20 feet away. But Will's thumb kept tracing slow circles over Oliver's pulse for a long moment before he finally reluctantly let go. For the rest of the morning they worked in a charged electric silence, shoulders brushing far more often than the task required, both of them entirely too aware of the other's hands. Late November brought the first real cold, frost silvering the mountain ridges at dawn, and with it came the thing neither of them had said out loud yet, hanging heavy and sweet in every shared glance, every lingering goodbye at the bakery door. It was Maddie who finally forced the issue, cornering Oliver in the walk-in cooler while he restocked butter. "You two are going to combust," she said flatly. "I'm serious. I give it 2 more weeks before one of you spontaneously catches fire from all the repressed feelings, and I refuse to be the one who has to explain that to the fire department. We're taking it slow. You've been taking it slow since October. It's almost December. Slow is one thing, Oliver. This is a geological process. He might not even." He rearranged his entire firm's schedule so he could personally oversee a job site 2 blocks from your bakery, Maddie said, ticking points off on flour-dusted fingers. "He knows your coffee order. He knows Biscuit's vet's phone number, which he should not know. He looks at you like you're the last cinnamon roll on a Sunday morning. If that man doesn't want you, I will personally eat my apron." Oliver laughed despite himself, but the laugh caught, turned into something more honest. "I'm scared, Mads. Last time I let myself want something this much, it went badly, I know, but Oliver. Maddie's voice softened, dropped the teasing edge entirely. That guy is not your ex. He drove through a thunderstorm to bring you blueprints and stayed for hot chocolate. He got flattened by your dog and came back the next morning for more. People don't do that unless they mean it. That evening, closing alone, Oliver found himself standing at the darkened front window, looking out at the glow of Will's job site 2 blocks down, lit up gold against the early winter dusk, and made a decision that felt less like courage and more like simply, finally, running out of reasons to be afraid. He thought about his mother, whom he hadn't even introduced to Will yet, and what she'd say if she knew he was standing here, frozen, letting fear make his choices for him again. He thought about the version of himself from 2 years ago, quiet and folded up and small, agreeing that more direction was a reasonable thing to lose someone over. He thought about Will's hand at his wrist in a church parking lot, steady and certain, asking for nothing but the truth. He walked. Coat, no umbrella, cold air biting at his cheeks, heart going fast the whole 2 blocks. Will was on the site alone, reviewing blueprints under a temporary work light, breath fogging in the cold. He looked up at the sound of Oliver's footsteps, surprise softening into something warmer almost instantly. "Oliver, everything okay?" "No," Oliver said, and then, because there was no version of this conversation that worked if he chickened out now, "I mean, yes, nothing's wrong. I needed to say something before I lost my nerve." Will set down the blueprints slowly, giving Oliver his full, undivided attention in a way that made his knees feel unreliable. "I like you," Oliver said, the words rushing out before he could second-guess them. "I've liked you since you got tackled by my dog. Honestly, which is deeply embarrassing to admit, but it's true. And I know we've been doing this thing, where we get close and then something interrupts us and neither of us says anything, and I'm tired of waiting for the universe to give us permission. So I'm just going to say it, I like you. A lot. And I don't know if you." Will crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and kissed him. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't careful the way Oliver had half expected, given how patient Will had been about everything else. One hand came up to cradle the back of Oliver's neck, fingers threading warm into his hair, and the other settled at his waist, pulling him in close enough that Oliver could feel the fast, unsteady beat of Will's heart against his own chest. The work light hummed somewhere behind them, cold November air biting at Oliver's exposed skin everywhere Will's warmth didn't reach, and none of it mattered. Not the cold, not the light, not the 2 blocks he'd walked in the dark to get here. Because Will was kissing him like he'd been waiting exactly as long as Oliver had, like the words had barely beaten him to it. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, both of them breathing hard, fog curling white between them, Will let out a short laugh, low and disbelieving. "I've been trying to figure out how to say that for 6 weeks, he admitted, voice rough. "I had a whole plan. Dinner. Somewhere with actual ambiance, not a job site at 8 p.m. in November. I ruined your plan. You improved my plan considerably." Will's thumb traced slow along Oliver's jaw, the same way it had that day in the garden, like he'd been wanting to finish that gesture for weeks. "For the record, I like you too. A lot. Have for a while." "Since the coat?" "Since the coat," Will confirmed, smiling against Oliver's temple. "Ruined the coat, gained the whole rest of my life. Best trade I ever made." "You don't have to come," Oliver said, for what was probably the 4th time that week, as he wrestled a lopsided pumpkin pie into a cardboard box on the passenger seat of his car. "My mom's version of a quiet family dinner involves 11 people, 3 different card games, and at least 1 argument about football that somehow all always ends in someone crying. I like pie. I like football. I am, statistically, unbothered by crying," Will said, sliding into the driver's seat like the matter was settled, because in his mind it clearly was. "Also, you've mentioned your mother roughly 40 times since we started dating, and I'd like to put a face to the woman who apparently taught you to alphabetize spice racks. That was one time. It made sense. It made you insufferable to shop with. I stand by my assessment." Oliver's mother, Linda Bennett, 61, greeted them at the door of her house in Hendersonville, 20 minutes south of Asheville, wearing an apron that read, "Kiss the cook," in cracked, decades-old iron-on letters, and an expression of undisguised delight the moment she spotted Will half a step behind her son. "So this is the architect," she said, looking Will up and down with the frank, appraising eye of a woman who had raised 3 sons and buried none of her opinions. Rosalind always did say you'd bring home someone who could actually fix things around a house. Oliver's father, God rest him, once tried to hang a shelf and put a hole clean through to the guest bedroom. Mom, I'm complimenting your boyfriend, Oliver. Let me compliment your boyfriend. Dinner was, by Bennett family standards, a relatively contained disaster. Oliver's older brother arrived 40 minutes late with a store-bought pie he insisted, unconvincingly, was homemade, the gravy split twice before Will, apron borrowed, sleeves rolled, utterly unbothered by the chaos of an unfamiliar kitchen. Quietly rescued it with a whisk and a technique he explained. When pressed, he'd learned from a very patient contractor's wife in Charlotte who fed our whole crew every winter. The football argument arrived precisely on schedule during dessert, loud and good-natured, and Will, to Oliver's genuine astonishment, held his own in it with an easy confidence that made Oliver's mother laugh so hard she had to set down her fork. It was afterward in the kitchen, drying dishes, while the rest of the house dissolved into a card game neither of them had been recruited for, that Linda caught Oliver's arm and pulled him gently aside. "He keeps looking at you like you're the last piece of pie," she said quietly, nodding toward the doorway where Will's laugh carried in from the living room, warm and unguarded. "Your father used to look at me like that. Don't let this one get away being scared, sweetheart. I watched you fold yourself up small for 2 years after the last one. This one's not asking you to be smaller." Oliver's throat went tight. "I know, Mom. Do you? I'm working on it. Good boy." She patted his cheek the way she'd done since he was 6 years old, and pressed a foil-wrapped stack of leftovers into his hands with the finality of a woman who considered the conversation closed. "Now go rescue him from your brother before Marcus starts explaining his fantasy football league in full. Nobody deserves that on a first visit." Will, it turned out, needed no rescuing. By the time Oliver returned to the living room, he'd not only survived Marcus's fantasy football monologue, but had somehow talked him into a spirited debate about stadium roof engineering that left Marcus looking genuinely delighted to have found, in his little brother's boyfriend, someone who actually wanted to discuss load-bearing trusses at length. They drove home well past midnight, Oliver's mother's leftovers filling the whole car with the smell of turkey and sage, Biscuit, who had spent the day being spoiled rotten by Oliver's nieces, asleep and snoring in the back seat. "Your family's loud," Will said, not unkindly, one hand resting easy on Oliver's knee as the dark mountain roads unspooled ahead of them. "I liked it. Mine was always so quiet growing up. Just me and my dad, mostly, after my mom passed. Dinners were efficient. Not this." Oliver glanced over, something soft and aching moving through his chest at the quiet admission. "You can have this, if you want it. It comes with a lot of noise and my mother's opinions about your spice rack situation, but it's yours too now, if you want." Will was quiet for a moment, headlights sliding gold across his face in the dark. "Yeah," he said finally, voice a little rough. "I want." If Oliver had expected the weeks that followed to be uncomplicated bliss, he learned quickly that even the sweetest things came with growing pains. The trouble started small, a scheduling conflict, a cancelled dinner, Will's firm landing a second major contract in Charlotte that pulled him away 3 days a week for consultations. Oliver told himself it was fine, told himself he understood, that this was simply what dating a busy, talented architect looked like. But 3 weeks into the new schedule, standing alone in the bakery on a Friday night that was supposed to be their first real date since the kiss, watching another apologetic text light up his phone screen. "Stuck in Charlotte, client emergency. I'm so sorry, I'll make it up to you." Something old and familiar twisted in his chest. He didn't say anything. He told himself it was fine. He told himself this 3 more times over the following week, each time a little less convincingly at a tray of unglazed donuts for a full 2 minutes, and finally set down her piping bag with a heavy sigh. "Okay, what's wrong?" "Nothing." "Oliver, he's just busy," Oliver said, and even to his own ears it sounded thin. "It's a big contract, it's good for his firm. I'm happy for him. You look like someone stole your dog." "I'm fine, Maddie." He was not fine. And when Will finally returned from his 3rd trip to Charlotte that month, exhausted, apologetic, dropping onto one of the bakery's mismatched chairs with the particular heaviness of a man who'd been running on coffee and deadline adrenaline for days, Oliver realized he had a choice: swallow it again the way he always had, the way that had cost him a wedding once already, or say something. "I miss you," Oliver said, quiet, careful. That's the whole thing. It's not a complaint." I'm not asking you to turn down the contract. I just miss you, and I didn't know how to say that without it sounding like I was asking for something you can't give me right now. Will's expression shifted, the exhaustion falling away into something more alert, more attentive, like Oliver's words had cut straight through the fog of the last 3 weeks. I should have said something sooner, Will said. I got so deep in the Charlotte project I let 3 weeks go by without actually asking how you were doing with it. That's on me. Not a scheduling problem, a me problem. You don't have to fix your whole life for me. I'm not fixing my whole life, Will said, reaching across the small table to fold Oliver's hand into both of his own, thumb tracing slow, familiar circles over his knuckles. I'm fixing the part where I let the guy I'm falling in love with sit alone in his own bakery, wondering if he matters less than a client meeting. That part gets fixed regardless. Oliver's breath caught. The guy you're falling in love with, Will said, steady, certain, like he'd been sitting on the words and was almost relieved to finally set them down. Yeah, that's where I am, Oliver. I should have said it before I let 3 weeks of silence do the talking instead. Something in Oliver's chest, tight and anxious for weeks, finally, gently, came loose. I'm there too, he admitted, voice thick. Have been for a while, honestly. Will pulled his chair around the small table, close enough that their knees knocked together, and kissed him softly, unhurried, right there in the empty bakery, with the closed sign turned in the window, and the last of the evening light going gold and amber through the front glass. I'll block off Fridays, Will murmured against his mouth. No exceptions. Client emergencies can wait until Saturday. You don't have to. I want to, Will said. There's a difference. Let me want this, Oliver. He made good on it the very next week. Showed up that first protected Friday with a bag of takeout from the Thai place Oliver had mentioned once, weeks earlier in passing, and a bouquet of grocery store flowers he'd clearly bought with more enthusiasm than expertise, stems trimmed unevenly, one sunflower drooping sadly to one side. They were the least sad-looking ones, Will said, a little defensive, when he caught Oliver's expression. The florist closed early. This was a gas station. I love them, Oliver said, and meant it so completely that his voice cracked slightly on the second word, which made Will's whole face soften in a way that undid something tight and worried in Oliver's chest for good. They ate on the bakery's back stoop, take-out containers balanced on their knees, Biscuit sprawled contentedly between their feet, and talked, really talked, the kind of conversation that unspooled slow and easy once the hard part was already behind them, about nothing important and everything important, until the streetlights came on and neither of them noticed the cold. Fridays became sacred after that, not fancy, most weeks, just the two of them and whatever the bakery's leftover inventory happened to be, eaten on Oliver's couch with Biscuit sprawled across both their laps, like he'd personally arranged the relationship and expected credit for it. But sacred all the same. Winter softened into a first Christmas together, spent half at Oliver's cramped apartment above the bakery and half at Will's, trading string lights for garland until neither space felt like it belonged to only one of them anymore. They argued, cheerfully and at length, over whether the tree should be real or artificial. Will, practical to a fault, favored artificial. Oliver, sentimental about a childhood spent picking out trees with his father, refused to budge, and settled it, eventually, the way they settled most things, with a real tree that shed needles across Will's pristine apartment floor for 6 straight weeks, and Will complaining about it exactly once before quietly buying a better vacuum and never mentioning it again. Will gave Oliver a set of hand-forged bread lames engraved with his initials, the kind of gift that made Oliver go quiet and a little watery-eyed in front of Maddie, who did not let him live it down for a week. Oliver gave Will a framed photograph of the warehouse mid-construction, scaffolding and all. So you remember what it looked like the day it changed my whole life, he'd said, and watched Will's composure crack for exactly 3 seconds before he pulled Oliver into his lap and didn't say anything at all, just held on. Spring brought Ridgeline Studios framing complete brick exposed at last, and Oliver spent an unreasonable number of afternoons helping with the courtyard planting scheme, which mostly meant sitting on an overturned bucket handing Will plants, while offering opinions Will pretended to find unhelpful, and secretly followed almost every time. It was on one of those afternoons, dirt under both their fingernails, that Oliver caught Will watching him instead of the flower bed, a small private smile on his face that he didn't bother hiding when Oliver noticed. What? Oliver had asked. Nothing, Will said. Just this. You here, always underfoot, opinions about hydrangea placement you have no business having. I like it. I like all of it. Summer brought a trip neither of them could really afford to the Outer Banks. 4 days of sunburn and terrible motel coffee and long, lazy afternoons that stretched golden into evening. On the third night, they walked out past the dune grass to sit on the cooling sand, the Atlantic hushing dark and enormous beyond them, and Will, half asleep against Oliver's shoulder with sand still caught in his hair, mumbled something about someday, a house, somewhere with a real kitchen, said so quietly, so unguarded, that Oliver wasn't sure Will even fully registered saying it out loud. Oliver said nothing back, only pressed a kiss to the top of his head, and turned the words over in his mind for weeks afterward, like a stone worn smooth from handling, taking them out again and again just to feel their shape. Fall came around again. A full year, now, since a dog with no impulse control had introduced them via bodily impact, and they marked the occasion with cinnamon rolls at 6 a.m., laughing too hard over how ridiculous the whole story still sounded out loud. Chris made them retell it at every dinner party for the rest of the year, embellishing it slightly more each time, until the version that circulated among their friends involved a coat, sacrificed to the cause of true love, and a dog who was, in Chris's retelling, clearly working as Cupid's unpaid intern, and frankly underpaid for the results. Early that fall, Will finally brought Oliver down to Charlotte to meet his father, Robert Hayes, 64, a retired contractor with Will's same steady quiet, and the particular gruffness of a man who showed love mostly through fixing things without being asked. Robert greeted Oliver on the porch of the small brick ranch house Will had grown up in, looked him over for a long, silent moment, and then simply said, "You're the one with the dog," in a tone that suggested this fact alone had already earned Oliver considerable credibility. Dinner was quieter than Thanksgiving with the Bennetts had been. Just the three of them at a kitchen table Robert had built himself decades earlier, the wood worn smooth with use, but no less warm for it. Robert asked careful, practical questions about the bakery, about lease terms and supplier contracts, in the particular love language of a man who expressed care through logistics, and seemed satisfied, by the end of the meal, that his son had chosen someone with his feet reasonably on the ground. It was only once Will had stepped out to the garage to find a tool his father wanted to show off that Robert turned to Oliver, voice-dropping gruffness falling away entirely. "He hasn't brought anyone here since his mother passed," Robert said quietly. "Not once in 6 years. I want you to know that. Whatever you're doing right, keep doing it." Oliver, throat suddenly tight, managed only a nod, and Robert, seeming to consider the moment sufficiently handled, clapped him once on the shoulder and went to go find his son before either of them could get any more sentimental about it. There was one bad week that fall, too, the kind every couple has and nobody talks about afterward, when Robert had a health scare of his own, weeks after that dinner, and Will drove down alone at 2 a.m. without waking Oliver, not wanting to worry him over what turned out to be, thankfully, a false alarm. Oliver found out the next afternoon from a groggy, apologetic phone call, and the hurt of being left out cut sharper than either of them expected. "I didn't want to scare you over nothing," Will had said, exhausted, guilty. "That's not your call to make alone," Oliver said, gentler than he felt but firm all the same. "Scared with you is better than left behind, Will. I need you to let me in, even at 2 a.m, especially at 2 a.m. Will had driven straight back to Asheville that evening, shown up at the bakery with his father's health perfectly fine, and his own eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and remorse, and they'd talked it through slowly, honestly, on the same overturned flour buckets, where they'd first sat out a storm together. A small fight that taught them both something neither had known they still needed to learn. That love wasn't only showing up for the good moments, but trusting each other enough to be let into the frightening ones too. A second winter passed quieter than the first, steadier, the kind of quiet that came from two people who no longer had to guess at each other, who had already weathered one real storm of their own making and come out closer for it. Will's firm finished the final punch list items on Ridgeline Studios just after New Year's, and by the time the frost began to thin on the mountain ridges again, 18 months had passed since a scaffold, a leash, and one deeply unqualified dog had rerouted both their lives entirely. That second spring, The old textile warehouse finally opened its doors as Ridgeline Studios, a mixed-use building of design offices and small artisan shops that had, in the 18 months since Biscuit's infamous tackle, become something of a neighborhood landmark. Exposed brick preserved exactly as Will had promised, big arched windows that caught the morning light, a courtyard garden Oliver had helped design the planting scheme for, now blooming in earnest for the first time. The opening celebration spilled out onto Biltmore Avenue on a warm April evening, string lights crisscrossing overhead, half the neighborhood gathered with wine glasses and small plates from the new studios. Oliver stood near the edge of it all, watching Will work the crowd with the easy confidence of a man finally seeing a year and a half of vision made solid and real, and felt, not for the first time, a swell of pride so large it nearly stole his breath. "Excuse me, everyone." Will's voice carried suddenly over the crowd, and Oliver realized with a start that Will had climbed onto the low garden wall, glass raised, the whole gathered neighborhood turning to look. "I want to thank a few people before we get too far into the wine." He thanked the contractors, the city planning office, Chris, his small dedicated team, and then his eyes found Oliver's across the courtyard, and something in his expression softened into an entirely different register. "And I want to thank the man who a year and a half ago tackled me into a puddle via his extremely undertrained dog," Will said, and the crowd laughed, warm and easy, "and in doing so gave me the best reason I've ever had to actually look up when I walk past a building instead of hurrying by." Oliver felt his face go hot as every head in the courtyard turned toward him. "Oliver," Will said, stepping down off the wall, crossing the courtyard with the same steady certainty he did everything. "I designed this whole building, thinking about people looking up, about things worth stopping for. And somewhere in the middle of pouring concrete and arguing with contractors about brick tolerances, I realized the thing I actually wanted to build a life around wasn't a building at all." He was in front of Oliver now, and Oliver's heart was doing something enormous and unsteady, and the whole courtyard had gone hushed with the particular held-breath quality of a crowd sensing something big. Will got down on one knee, and Oliver's whole world narrowed to the small circle of him. The dust of a 2-year-old memory still somehow clinging to the edges of this moment, the same steady brown eyes that had once looked up at him from a puddle, now looking up at him like this instead. "I love you," Will said simply, and the string lights caught gold in his eyes. And somewhere behind Oliver was distantly aware of Maddie already crying into Chris's shoulder. "I love your terrible dog and your 6 a.m. cinnamon rolls and the way you apologize to inanimate objects when you bump into them. I want Fridays with you for the rest of my life, and Saturdays, and every ordinary Tuesday in between. Marry me?" Oliver, laughing and crying in roughly equal measure, hands pressed over his own mouth, managed to get out a yes, before Will was up and kissing him, the whole courtyard erupting into applause and cheers, string lights swaying gently overhead, Biscuit somewhere in the crowd barking with an enthusiasm that suggested he, too, understood the significance of the moment, even if he mostly just wanted attention. They married that October, exactly 2 years from the storm that had first cracked something open between them. In the courtyard garden Oliver had helped design, string lights overhead, the whole neighborhood gathered again. This time not by accident, but on purpose, every person there because they'd chosen to be. The morning of the wedding, Oliver's mother fussed over his collar in the small dressing room off the courtyard, blinking too fast, refusing point-blank to acknowledge she was crying. "Your grandmother would have loved this building," she said, smoothing a wrinkle that wasn't there. "All that brick. She always said the old textile warehouse had good bones, back when it was falling apart. Guess she was right about more than the building." Chris, serving as Will's best man, spent the morning alternating between genuine sentiment and relentless teasing, at one point attempting unsuccessfully to sew a tiny fabric rain cloud onto Will's boutonniere for historical accuracy. Maddie, Oliver's maid of honor in a role she had lobbied for aggressively since the engagement, cried before the ceremony even started, cried during the vows, and cried again during the first dance, blaming it each time, unconvincingly, on seasonal allergies, despite it being an unusually pollen-free October. Miss Rosie's old cake stand held their wedding cake. 3 tiers, cinnamon and vanilla, Oliver's own recipe adjusted from his grandmother's handwritten card, the one with the corner stained brown from decades of buttery thumbprints. Chris gave a best man's toast that somehow made everyone laugh and cry simultaneously, ending with the line, "I've personally heard the coat story 11 times, and I will happily hear it 1100 more." Linda Bennett gave an impromptu, entirely unplanned toast of her own shortly after, mostly about spice racks and load-bearing trusses that left the entire courtyard in stitches. Biscuit, fitted with a small bow tie he tolerated for exactly the length of the ceremony, and not 1 second longer, sat between them at the altar with the solemn dignity of a dog who understood, on some level, that he had started all of this. He made it through the vows admirably and ruined the recessional entirely by bolting after a squirrel halfway down the aisle, dragging a groomsman with him. A final, fitting echo of the accident that had brought the whole night into being, one that had every guest laughing too hard to mind the delay. When it came time for vows, Oliver went first, voice unsteady on the first few words before finding its footing. "I used to think love was supposed to announce itself," he said, "with something big and dramatic. Turns out mine introduced itself with a dog and a ruined coat, which I've decided is on brand for us. Will, you didn't just build a beautiful building 2 blocks from my bakery. You built the kind of steady, patient, ridiculous love I didn't think I got to have twice. I choose that. I choose you. Every ordinary Tuesday for the rest of my life." Will's vows were shorter and rougher around the edges, his composure cracking somewhere in the middle in a way that made the whole courtyard go soft and quiet around them. "I spent years designing buildings I thought I'd be remembered for," he said. "Turns out the thing I actually built worth remembering was us. I love you. I loved you before I even had the right words for it. And I'm going to spend every day after this one making sure you never have to wonder if you're my last cinnamon roll on a Sunday morning. You are. You always will be." Their first dance was, by unanimous and cheerful agreement, a disaster. Will led with the stiff precision of a man who'd clearly practiced in front of a mirror. Oliver followed with the enthusiasm of a man who had not practiced at all, and by the second chorus they'd abandoned any pretense of technique entirely, simply swaying together, foreheads touching, laughing at nothing and everything, the whole courtyard fading to a warm blur of string lights around them. And when Will slid the ring onto Oliver's finger, murmuring finally, under his breath in a voice meant only for him, Oliver thought about a rain-soaked morning 2 Octobers prior, a ruined coat, a dog with no self-control, and the particular, ordinary magic of a life built one small collision at a time. 2 years later, on an ordinary Sunday in early spring, sunlight came slanting warm through the kitchen window of the little craftsman house on Maple Street. The real kitchen Will had mumbled about on a beach half asleep, once upon a someday that had, eventually, simply arrived. The light caught the steam rising off 2 mugs of coffee, and, less romantically, the flour currently dusted across Will's dark hair. "I told you not to let me handle the sifter," Will said, eyeing his own reflection in the darkened microwave door with visible betrayal. "I said you could help." There's a difference between helping and enthusiastically weaponizing kitchen's equipment. You're the one who married an architect and expected precision cooking, not chaos energy. "I married you for your forearms, not your baking skills," Oliver said, and laughed outright when Will flicked a small cloud of flour directly at him in retaliation, catching him square in the chest. "Oh, that's it," Oliver said, already reaching for the bag of flour himself, and what followed was less a baking lesson and more a full-scale kitchen skirmish, both of them laughing too hard to properly aim. Flour drifting down like strange indoor snow. Biscuit, older now, grayer around the muzzle, but no less enthusiastic, barked and leapt between them like the whole thing had been arranged specifically for his entertainment, tail thumping against cabinets, utterly delighted with his own supervisory role. It ended, as most of their disagreements did, with Will backing Oliver gently against the counter, both of them breathless and thoroughly floured, foreheads pressed together, laughing too hard to actually kiss for a solid 10 seconds before they finally managed it. "We look like ghosts," Oliver said against his mouth. "Very handsome ghosts. Extremely handsome ghosts who now have to clean an entire kitchen before Chris and Maddie get here for brunch." Will groaned, dropping his head to Oliver's shoulder in mock despair, which was how he happened to be facing away from the window when Oliver spotted, over his shoulder, Chris's car already pulling into the driveway a full 40 minutes early. Undoubtedly Maddie's doing, since she'd never once in 4 years managed to arrive anywhere on time except, notably, this. "They're early," Oliver reported, resigned. Of course they are. Will straightened, took one look at the flour-dusted disaster of the kitchen, and, with the particular calm of a man who had once talked a city planning board out of rejecting an entire building permit, said, "New plan. We tell them we did this on purpose. A theme brunch. Rustic. Artisanal. They will never believe that. They don't have to believe it. They just have to be too polite to say otherwise for the first 10 minutes, which is all the time I need to make coffee." Oliver laughed, kissed the corner of Will's mouth once more for good measure, and reached for the broom while Will wrestled the coffee maker into submission, both of them moving through the small chaos of their kitchen with the kind of practiced, wordless coordination that only came from years of mornings just like this one, some quieter, some louder, none of them, in 4 years, ever quite boring. "Hey," Will said later, once the flour had been swept away and the coffee was finally brewing, and there was a rare, quiet minute before the doorbell rang, his hand finding Oliver's at the counter, thumb tracing slow over his knuckles the way it always had, since that very first storm. "Best trade I ever made. Still think that, even covered in flour? Especially covered in flour." The doorbell rang. Maddie's voice already carrying through the door, bright and impatient, demanding to know why nobody had let her in yet, and Biscuit took off barking toward the sound with the same reckless, joyful abandon that had started this whole story on a rainy sidewalk 2 blocks from a half-finished building 4 years and 1 whole lifetime ago. Maddie swept in first, a bottle of orange juice in one hand and a garment bag in the other. For the farmer's market later, don't ask, it's a whole thing. Took one look at the flour-dusted kitchen and the two of them standing there in matching guilty expressions, and grinned like Christmas had come early. "You two absolute disasters," she said, delighted. "It has been 4 years, and you still can't make pancakes without turning it into a crime scene." It was a theme, Will said, with what remained of his dignity. "Rustic. Artisanal. It was chaos, and I love you both for it." Maddie set the orange juice down hard enough to make Biscuit startle, then immediately crouched to fuss over him instead, cooing in a voice she reserved exclusively for the dog. "Yes, hello, hello. You're still the best decision either of them ever made. Yes, you are." Chris arrived a beat behind her, take out coffee cups in a cardboard tray, surveying the kitchen with the air of a man conducting a structural inspection. "This," he announced, "would never pass code. Nobody asked the architect," Oliver said. "The architect's business partner is asking anyway. There's flour on the ceiling, William." "How? We don't talk about the ceiling. It took the better part of 20 minutes to actually get brunch on the table. Real pancakes this time, made with considerably more focus once an audience was present to judge the results, and another hour after that for the 4 of them to still be sitting around the kitchen island, plates long empty, coffee gone lukewarm, deep in the kind of unhurried Sunday conversation that used to feel, to Oliver, like something that only happened to other people. Chris was recounting, with increasingly theatrical embellishment, the story of the coat for what had to be the 100th time, and Maddie was arguing, not for the first time, that Biscuit deserved formal recognition, possibly a plaque, for services rendered to the Asheville dating scene. "A whole building went up because of that dog," she said, gesturing at Biscuit, who had claimed the sunniest patch of kitchen floor and showed no interest in defending his own legacy. "Ridgeline Studios owes its existence to poor impulse control and a wet leash. That's history. That belongs in a plaque." "I will personally veto any plaque," Will said, though he was smiling, one hand finding Oliver's beneath the counter, thumb tracing its familiar slow circle. "Some things are better left as just ours." Later, once Chris and Maddie had gone, bickering cheerfully on their way out about whose turn it was to host next month, Oliver stood at the sink finishing the last of the dishes while Will dried, the two of them falling easily into the old rhythm, no words needed, just the quiet clink of plates and the low hum of the radio Will always left on in the kitchen without ever quite admitting he liked it. "Hey," Will said later, once the counters were finally clean and there was a rare, quiet minute before the afternoon properly began, his hand finding Oliver's at the counter, thumb tracing slow over his knuckles the way it always had, since that very first storm. "Best trade I ever made. Still think that. Every single day. Even covered in flour? Especially covered in flour." Outside, the mountain stood green and quiet under the morning light, and inside, in a small kitchen still faintly dusted white, 2 men who had once collided by pure accident stood wrapped around each other for one last unhurried moment, No puddle, no dog, no accident required anymore. Just Sunday, just them. Just the easy, ordinary miracle of choosing each other, again, every single day.